Okay, everyone, welcome back. It's nice to see everyone again. I hope everybody's been enjoying the classes and the talk so far. I was waiting for some more people to join, but I think we're probably better to get started. Just a reminder that if you have any questions for me, I'm going to be answering them at the end, as with screen sharing, it's a bit complicated with the chat function. So I will answer any questions that you have at the end for me. So obviously this talk is about common running injuries and how to prevent them. A lot of this is important because we want you to enjoy your time in order to love what you're running. Like, we don't want you to have any issues at the beginning and have to take time off of running, or be training for an event and have to take time off of running. So I really like to do this talk because I want you to enjoy from start to end your experience with our program, and also to kind of encourage you to continue on and challenge yourselves and go further. So why do runners get injured? Running is actually a really highly repetitive activity. It's very much front and back motion activity, similar to cycling. And so because of this, it's important to listen to your body and see if something presents itself to deal with it early. So I thought I'd put a video here just so you can really visualize what happens when we're running. So as you can see, it's very much going forward. We're using the same muscles time and time again. So if you have an issue in this kinetic chain, which is from the foot all the way up, if there's some kind of fault there, after about 5 or 10 kilometers, you're going to probably feel it and you're likely going to develop an injury. So the hopes of today is that we're going to be able to identify some things that could help you prevent getting injured, and give you some solutions that if you do start to feel these little aches and pains, that we can kind of nip it in the bud and get you going again. So the way I've divided this up is into 5 of the big kind of ones that we'll see from running. And I thought that I would start with Achilles tendonitis. So the Achilles is actually a large tendon. If you roll down to the back of your calf, right above your ankle, you'll feel a thick cord there. And that's actually your Achilles tendon. It's the one thing that attaches 3 big muscles in your calf to your heel. And without it, you actually can't point your toe. So it's a really important one. If you start to get pain here, it's important to address it early. So what basically happens is that the tendon becomes stressed, because running is a very forward pushing activity. And under the stress, the tendon actually tightens and it gets irritated or inflamed. If the stress continues and you don't correct what the irritation is, the tendon can go on to rupture or tear, which is a really bad thing to get to. So those are the people you see on their knee kind of wheeling around because they can't walk, or on crutches or in casts if it's been torn, and if it's been completely ruptured. And if it's a tear, you're basically going to be not running for a while. So what are the symptoms? How are you going to know that you have this kind of thing? So usually there's a dull or sharp pain anywhere along the back of the tendon, usually though very close to the heel. You're also going to feel a little bit of limited range of motion in your ankle. Sometimes there's a bit of heat and sometimes there's redness. You may also identify a little bit of a bump right at the bottom of the tendon where you feel it. So things that can contribute to this: poor stretching, so you either haven't warmed up or you haven't done any proper stretching at the end. If you've increased your distance too quickly, which is why we largely stand by the 10% rule of increasing you in a very gradual, controlled manner. Overtraining is kind of along the same lines. Excessive hill training or speed work. So we've just integrated hill training and speed work in the last few weeks for many of the groups. So if you go a little bit too hard on the hill, or you do too many hills in a row, you're going to be more apt to get this. Footwear is always really important, because if the foot is not flexible, you're not going to be able to actually bend at the toe, and your ankle is going to pick up a lot of that actual motion, and you're probably going to put too much tension on the tendon. And that goes along very well with overpronation of feet. So if your foot is kind of rolling in too much, you're likely going to affect the ankle. So things that you can do to help prevent this. One thing is to stretch 2 of the calf muscles that are at the back of your calf. One is called the gastrocnemius. It actually crosses 2 joints. So a common problem with this is that people don't stretch it properly. And the soleus is another one. The difference between the two is the soleus actually does not cross the knee. So you have to stretch it differently. I find most people actually stretch only one of the groups and not both. So I'm going to show you how to do that. Wearing proper shoes is, I can't tell you, it's the most important thing. And if you aren't sure, you should be evaluated. I've already talked to many of you, suggested a few things, changed out the footwear, and now you're back off and running again, which is fantastic. But it really does come down to the foot, because if your foot is not being supportive and you're getting too much rolling on either way, your calf is going to activate more and you're going to get more tension and you're going to develop Achilles tendonitis. You can also be evaluated for orthotics. So for people who really pronate or have their ankle tipping in or out too much, you likely would have to speak to our chiropodist, Megan Grantham. You're going to avoid, you're going to do a gradual progression for training. That's super important, and we have you doing that through this program. You're also going to avoid excessive hill training. So you're not going to just do a run that's completely uphill. That's probably not a good idea. You need to incorporate rest into your training plan. You can't run every day. You're going to really overuse that tissue. And so that's where Leslie's talk next week will really be important, because it talks about cross training. You cannot just run all the time. You really need to do other things. And the biggest one that I would say is that you should reach out and address any muscle imbalances. It's very, very common that people have weakness of the hip or some kind of imbalance that leads over time as you're running to fatigue, which will lead to other biomechanical issues. So just to give you an example of how to stretch your gastrocnemius, I'm providing you with this video. So let me just get that going.
Up straight, holding onto a supportive surface. Step your affected leg backwards. Make sure your toes are facing forwards and your heel is on the floor. Keeping your knee straight on your back leg, lean forwards until you feel a stretch in your calf. The front knee will bend. Hold this position.
So the important part with that stretch is that the leg is kept straight. That's going to address the gastrocnemius because it crosses both your ankle and your knee. The one that most people forget about is this one, your soleus. Oops.
Up straight, close to a supportive surface. Take a small step backwards with your affected leg. Keep your toes pointing forwards and your heel on the floor. Bend both of your knees and sink your weight down into your back heel. You should feel this stretch in your lower calf at the back of your heel. Hold this position.
So the big difference to note between those two stretches is that the second one had a bent knee, and you really have to kind of sit down in order to get a lower stretch. And that's going to really identify that soleus muscle that does not cross the knee. I would say that's the most common thing that people don't do. They only do the one stretch and not the second. So moving on from that one, we're going to talk about a super common one called lliotibial band syndrome. We kind of refer to it as ITB syndrome or ITBS, as you can see in the brackets. This usually is identified by pain right on the outside part of your knee. The reason for this is because running is very a forward and backward activity. A lot of the time, if you have weakness in your glute or tightness in the front of your hip, it leads to a friction of that band. So the band in the picture, you can see two red circles. That band is that white tissue that goes down the side of the knee. And when the tissue is imbalanced, you can get a lot of friction, which is almost like when you rub your hands together, you get heat, and it'll lead to irritation over time. So you might not have this initially in the first 5K when you're running, but it will progress. Usually runners, I find, when they're about 8, 9, 10 kilometers in, if they have poor shoes or poor mechanics, that's when you're going to notice it. So it usually will start with a bit of a dull ache, and then it will progress. That's how you're going to know you have it. A dull ache in the side of your knee, and then as you keep running for weeks, it'll start to change to a severe or sharp pain. It also is worse when going down the stairs or specifically downhill. So I thought I'd give you a little bit of a video just so that you can see this is the back of a leg. And so we're looking at the hamstring muscle, calf. And that is basically, if you look at the back of the knee, you can see all these tendons right behind it. And when you're running forward and backward, if those tendons and muscles are imbalanced, you're going to get friction between them, and you're also going to get a bit of a biomechanical strain. And then you can see how on the right, this is your IT band on the far right, that is white. You can see that if that knee is not moving straight forward in a proper range, you can see how that band would snap over the small little bony area on the side of the knee, right at the top. So that's what we're trying to prevent. And often it comes from something going on at your hip or something coming on lower at your knee. So what sort of things really aggravate this? Running on a bank surface. So for all of you city runners who run on a sidewalk, the sidewalks are sloped. So it's a good idea to change direction so that your bottom leg or the leg closest to the road is not always the same, because it can create a bit of a bowing, which can affect how the band in the hip is working. You also really want to make sure that you have an adequate warm-up or cool down, like Dan Stasiak showed us earlier in the series. And always don't increase your distances too quickly or do too much excessive downhill running. I think the first time I really struggled with this as an issue was when I ran the Sporting Life 10K, which is largely downhill. And so you're constantly trying to break yourself. And the friction happens as you straighten your leg out in that last like 30 degrees to straightening, because that's when the friction goes over the bone. And that's what you do when you run downhill. You're constantly reaching out with your leg in front of you and slowing yourself down. So there's a good chance that if the hip is weak, you're gonna get that friction at the side of your knee. Worn out running shoes, I would say, is probably one of the top things I look to, because often they're a culprit. And also overstriding. I believe Stacy talked about overstriding, but you don't want to be reaching out extra far, because that also engages that extra extension of the knee. Things that you'd have to consider based on your own body would be your arches. So on the right, there's a picture of overpronation, which is a kind of a flat foot, pronation, which is just a bit mild, and what would be ideal, which is neutral. So you can see that when the foot falls in, often what will happen is you're going to get a compensation at your knee and at your hip. And that will allow for that kind of bowing or that friction to happen at the side of your knee. Women typically have wider hips than men, so that's something that we obviously can't change, just kind of how you're born. But because it's wide, it's called a Q angle. So the band will start wider and come down, and it can also allow for some friction. There's some things that you obviously can't change, but we just want to make it as beneficial or as pain-free as possible. So the wide hips, there's not that much you can do with other than making sure that your hips are strong and that you've got the right footwear. Sometimes people also come to us with uneven leg lengths, and so that's going to affect how your pelvis is sitting. So that's something that you would have to go and have assessed properly by a therapist, either a rehab professional, physio, chiro, osteo. Sports medicine can also do the same. But it's an easy fix. It could be muscular, where you could have tightness or weakness, or it could be something that's actually structural that should be addressed early on. Muscle imbalances or weak hip abductors, which is kind of like your glutes, or limited ankle mobility are probably the largest things that I end up treating. A lot of the time, runners have weak bums or weak glutes because it's a very forward-based motion. They're not kind of getting into the one muscle that supports your hip positioning. So again, that's something that you would have to come out. And if we were in person, I would pull one of you out of the crowd and kind of do a muscle test on a specific muscle. And 9 times out of 10, I can push you to the ground with 2 fingers versus the other side, which is quite strong if you have this as an issue. How are you going to prevent it? So you think that your IT band's starting to get tight, or you're starting to develop a bit of that dull feeling at the side of your leg. The thing you really should start with is shoes. Shoes actually only last 300 to 500 miles, or every 3 to 4 months you should be changing them. If you're running really high mileage, half marathon or full marathon, we often say that you should have 2 pairs of shoes and you should alternate between them. That way you're not wearing a shoe down and then putting a new shoe on. You're always kind of having the same kind of wear on both of them, and then you rotate them through. Some people even write the mileage down inside their shoe so that they know exactly when they started using them. You want to increase mileage slowly and add hills obviously gradually. You want to avoid the uneven surfaces. The other surface that you want to be careful of are tracks, because you're always running in the same direction. So it's a good idea sometimes to go the other way, as long as you're not running with a whole bunch of people and crash into them. So if it's you alone on a track, I would alternate after every few, just going in a different direction. It also may keep things a bit more interesting. The other thing we look at is strengthening the stabilizers of your IT band. So that's really your hip, and making sure that your hip and the front of your hip are working the way that they should. And this is actually best done by coming to see one of us. That way we can muscle test and be specific as to what exactly is impaired and what you exactly have to strengthen. We do get a lot of questions about foam rollers, so I thought I would include a video here of how to foam roll your IT band. So let me start that.
Place the foam roller underneath the IT band. Stack your legs on top of one another to apply added pressure. Roll from the head of the femur to just above the knee joint. Do not roll over bone on a foam roller. Stay on the soft tissue.
So if anyone's actually tried to foam roll their IT bands and they're tight, you'll know that it's extremely painful. You're really trying to loosen the tissue around the band, not necessarily the band itself. You're just trying to break up any adhesion that would be there with the foam roller. If it's too painful, instead of stacking your legs as shown in the video, you can actually put your one foot kind of in front of you and use it to kind of leverage yourself off. That way you can kind of work into the tissue slowly. If you're able to do it a few times in a row, you'll start to see that it starts to become a bit easier. But it is painful when you first start doing it, especially if you're really in need of it. Often with IT band, you can kind of get a bit of a patellofemoral pain also involved. The two I find often can be similar because usually similar things cause them both. So patellofemoral pain syndrome is kind of like a term that just means knee pain. It's a very non-specific term. It just means there's pain under the knee, or maybe you have a bit of crepitus or crunching under the kneecap. So really, it's something that's important to address, because if you start to get the crunching under the kneecap, you can start to be wearing away at the cartilage, and it can start to develop into something worse, which would be like a bit of arthritis, early arthritis under the kneecap. This usually results from the chronic friction between the kneecap and the groove, and it's usually due to an imbalance of the muscles around the knee or a weakness of the hip. Symptoms that you have this usually include pain under the kneecap or around the sides of the kneecap. You'd get a crepitus or grinding when the knee is bent. So you might notice when you go into a squat or when you go up or downstairs, you feel a bit of crunching or popping. So that's an early sign that you might want to take a look at this. After hill running, you'll usually have quite a bit of severe pain, and you can get swelling of the knee. Causes of this usually include, again, muscle imbalances, biomechanics. So if there's too much pronation or supination of the foot, so too much flat-footedness or going onto the outside of your arch, that will cause it, because your kneecap won't be tracking straight forward and back. Because your kneecap is it's like a triangle shape or a diamond shape, and it sits in a groove. And really you want that to be going forward and backward. You don't want it to be going from side to side. And if tissue is too tight, it will pull it over. And of course, the other thing that is difficult, but we can't do other than strengthen, it's hard to kind of avoid, but wider hips tend to be a cause as well. So things that we can do to prevent this are stretching your quads, so the front of your legs, your hamstrings, the back of your legs, the IT bands, which I just showed you how to use the foam roller, and your glutes. You're gonna check out your shoes again. I know it's kind of like being repetitive, but really it's important. Make sure that they're the proper ones. You need to wear orthotics if you have them for biomechanical issues. Avoid excessive downhill running, again. So never just run downhill all the time. You wanna make sure that it's not flat, not down, not up. You just kind of want to have a nice rolling mix. You need to address muscle imbalances early, because if you don't, they're just going to fester, and then you're going to end up taking a long time out of the sport. And again, gradual progression of training, which is why we have you doing the program that we have you doing. So here is another video.
Lie on your front and place the foam roller underneath your leg. Bend the opposite leg and bring it out to the side to help you move back and forth. Roll the entire length of the thigh muscle, staying off the knee joint.
Other things that you can use as well are things called a stick. It's like a long stick with rings in it, and it's like a rolling pin, but the little balls roll, and you can roll that down the front of your knee. If you don't have that, you could use a rolling pin. Anything that kind of rolls out that area. So if the foam rolling is too painful, just either using a rolling pin or doing something while sitting could be a good alternative that would then let you progress into a foam roller later. Shin splints are interesting. I think that when people start running for the first time initially, they often talk about shin splints. There's actually two kinds. There's some that run down the front of your shin, which would be indicated in the left leg of the diagram here. Or there's some that are on the inside of the shin. So if you go down the inside of your shin bone, just behind your ankle area, sometimes you're tender there. So the anterior shin splints are often the ones that new runners will feel. They're outside, they're pushing themselves forward, their calves get tight, and so the fronts of their shins are working really hard to pick up your toes. That's more of a weakness kind of thing, and that shin splint should go away. The one on the inside is a little bit more something that you're going to need to really address, because for those of you doing marathons or something long distance, it could be indicative of a shin splint or a stress fracture. But it tends to be something that's more mechanical that you're really going to have to address, or it's not going to go away. So mostly the pain for these things is usually worse at the beginning of a run, because as the muscle kind of warms up, the pain tends to get better. But what you'll find is that if you keep going for weeks and weeks, the pain persists a little bit longer before it goes away. And then at some point, you're just not able to run because it's too painful. So different things can cause it. So for the anterior shin splints, a lot of the time it's the calves. They're too tight. So you should roll those out in order to allow for the toes to be lifted and the ankle to bend better. You can also do some exercises where you practice on lifting your toes up. Overpronation is often a problem because your ankle likes to be in the middle. And so if it's rocking too much in one direction, especially the muscles of your calf have to compensate. And so that's going to lead to stretching of that tendon and irritation. So that's why you get the pain on the inside. A lot of the time it's people with flat feet or improper footwear, and their foot is dropping in too much and that tendon is getting pulled, and tendons don't like, they don't like that. So it's more that it gets irritated. So again, incorrect or worn out shoes, always one of the first things to check. Overtraining, again, I'd like to hope that none of you are doing that because you're following the plan closely. And beginners are obviously more susceptible to the problem. And usually it's just because you're using your calves in a new way. And that goes for the anterior shin splints, not so much the inside. The inside, I would usually say, is due to a pronation issue or a hip weakness issue. So what can you do if you're starting to feel these symptoms? I've already dealt with a few of you on this one. So the stretching and warm up is super important. You're gonna obviously wear good shoes. You're gonna incorporate hard and easy days, which is why we don't have you running all long distances. We have various distances that you're running every week with usually a 10% increase. As a therapist, we would typically do something like active release, which is a soft tissue release where you're stretching and shortening and lengthening muscles as you're stripping them or working through the tissue. We love lacrosse balls in the sports health area at Cleveland Clinic because they are inexpensive, tacky, and they are very good at getting into little spots. Foam rollers also help. Since I've already showed you a few foam roller things, I thought that I would use this as an opportunity to show you what you could do with a lacrosse ball. We sometimes even put the lacrosse ball on top of a foam yoga block and then put the ball on top of that just to really get into the area. But let me show you this first.
Sit on the floor with a ball underneath your calf. If you're unable to sit on the floor, you can also do this sat on a chair with your leg on a low table. Move your leg so that the ball moves around your calf. If you feel any particular tender spots, hold the ball in this position, applying some pressure until it releases.
So in that video, she actually used a tennis ball, which is not as fierce as a lacrosse ball. So there's different, and even worse than that would be a golf ball because it's even smaller. So you can make modifications again if it's too tender, and you can also make modifications based on what you have at home. People may often have a tennis ball, but not a lacrosse ball. The only difference is tennis balls tend to slip sometimes because they're fuzzy. Lacrosse balls, again, are tacky. And I think they're like $3 at Canadian Tire. The last one that I'm going to talk to you about is plantar fasciitis, which is often a killer for people who run because it's pain in the bottom of your foot and it's horrible. So below is a picture of the plantar fascia. It's a tissue that runs along the bottom of your foot. Usually it gets irritated when there's too much stress on the tissue, which causes the tissue to tear a little bit, and it results in inflammation and pain. The tears actually then have scar tissue that kind of cover it, that becomes less flexible, and it kind of facilitates the problem. Symptoms of it typically are pain at the bottom of your heel. Often people, when they first get out of bed in the morning, they're going to feel it when they first put their foot down, and then they often say, as I get going, it starts to get better. Causes of it usually are high arches or rigid feet, tight calves, because the calf goes right down into the plantar fascia or Achilles tendons. Again, the overpronation or improper position of the foot, improper or worn out shoes, and overtraining.
Plantar fasciitis is a painful condition affecting the sole of the foot, commonly in the heel. Those with the condition dislike pressure placed on this area. With the correct management, plantar fasciitis will resolve with conservative treatment. The plantar fascia is the thickened tissue on the sole of your foot. It pads the foot as well as having elastic properties to help transmit the forces of the calf muscle, allowing you to spring. It provides shape to your foot arch, allowing shock absorption and even distribution of your weight as you put load through it. If too much demand is placed on the plantar fascia, it can inflame and become painful. This can come about through increased activity, for example on a hiking holiday, or with increased stretch on the tissues, for example swapping to unsupportive sandals in the summer from the usual supportive lace-up shoes you wear the rest of the year. Recognizing the early warning signs is key to a speedy recovery. Avoid overdoing the activities that particularly provoke your pain. Weight-bearing activities such as walking and running are common aggravators, so temporarily reduce these, or substitute them for swimming or cycling, which do not put so much load through the plantar fascia. Address your footwear. If you tend to walk around in flat, loose, unsupportive shoes, try to find lace-up shoes with a good arch support. Try different insoles. If your pain is predominantly in your heel, you may find a donut-shaped insert helpful. Alternatively, you may find you need more of a support in your arch if the pain presents in this area. Roll an ice bottle under your foot. This not only acts to reduce the inflammation, but also helps to gently stretch the tissues. As the plantar fascia is a continuation of the tissues in your calf and Achilles tendon, it's important to address any tension in these areas. Stretch regularly through the day, ensuring you hold these positions. This will help to reduce any excess load on the plantar fascia. Remember, plantar fasciitis can take time to settle, so be patient and persevere with your treatment. In time, you'll be back doing what you love the most.
So in order to prevent, they went over some of it there. Earlier, I showed you some videos of calf stretches. So those 2 calf stretches I would do for sure. You can use a golf ball or the frozen water bottle. They used a frozen water bottle in the video to roll under the foot. The golf ball tends to be a little bit more poignant and specific. I would use the frozen water bottle if it was really irritated, and if it was kind of just really stiff or a bit angry, you could use the golf ball. Proper shoes or orthotics is needed, and we tend to do a little bit of soft tissue work when we work on people in clinic. We assess their kinetic chain and look for muscle imbalances again. And we also use shockwave in the clinic to help do this, which is a little machine that kind of gives pulses to kind of increase blood flow to help the tissue heal better. So here's one more video just to show you how to use, if I can find my cursor, there it is, how to use a ball.
Put in a seated position. Place a small ball underneath the arch of your foot. Apply pressure down on the ball and roll the ball from the base of the heel up to the base of the great toe.
So that's a really good one to do. It's a bit painful, but it's a good one to do. So I'm going to stop there with any questions. So I'm just going to, let me show you what you're going to do this week, and then I'll ask you for some questions. So the homework for this week is going to be the Learn to Run group, which I hope you guys are doing really well. I haven't been getting too many horrible emails yet about people falling apart, but please let me know. You're going to be doing 5 minutes running and 1 minute walking, and you're going to be doing 5 repeats of that. So you're going to be running for about 30 minutes total this week at a time. And hopefully you can get to do it 3, maybe 4 times a week, leaving some time in between runs if possible. The 10K group is going to be doing a 3-kilometer steady run and 4 by 400 meter hills. So that I think that's new for you this week. I'll talk about hills again. You're gonna do a 5-kilometer run just at a regular steady pace and a 7-kilometer run. So with the hills, what you want to do is make sure that you find a nice sized hill. You're going to be running at about 80 to 90% of your maximum going up the hill, really trying to stay forward on your toes and pumping your arms as you're going up the hill. So you really want to get away from using your heel because that's going to slow you down, and you really want to give it a good go going up the hill. Going down the hill, you can either walk down the hill or you can just do a light kind of light jog. Don't go too fast and fall on me. But you won't want to put your heel down too much because you would break again. So if you're going to do a light jog down the hill, you want to just lean a little bit forward to let gravity help you down the hill. And the half marathon group is going to do a 9-kilometer steady run, nice and easy. You're going to add a 7-kilometer tempo run. And you can do it 2 ways. You can just do it a little bit faster than you normally would, or you could do a fartlek, which is when you kind of pick a point ahead and you run a bit faster for different spurts of time. So you could pick a light, like 4 blocks away and say, okay, I'm going to run extra fast to that light. So that would be like a fartlek. And then you're going to do a 5-kilometer steady run and then a longer run of 16 kilometers. So a total of 37 kilometers this week. And the thing I would really encourage you to do is come by next week, because Leslie's going to be talking about cross training, and that really goes in hand with injuries, because if you are not actually looking at doing other activities, you're probably going to burn yourself out. You can't just do one thing all the time. A lot of our runners, they do weight training, which really helps with the muscle imbalances. You can do some swimming, which is great for your cardiovascular endurance, and it can make you a faster runner. So it's really important to look outside of just running all the time, or eventually you probably will develop some sort of injury. So I'm just going to stop this, and then I'm going to see if anyone has any questions. So Sarah says ankles overpronate, patellofemoral, things you can take into account every day to help prevent flare-ups. So the one thing that I would do is definitely look at your hip. So if you came into the office, what we would do is we would look at you doing like a single leg stand or a squat to look at what your knees are doing. We would assess how strong your hip is, because it may be a problem that your hip is too weak and it's allowing your knee to fall in and allowing your foot to fall in, which has been a few people that I've spoken to so far. And the other thing, it may be your footwear. So for you, I think, Sarah, if you're able to, I think that you could just talk to me offline about it, because it could be a few different factors that are irritating you there. And we can just quickly run through them and see what sort of things we can give you. The recordings of the presentations will be available, so they usually come out to you the next day or the day after as a link, and you can access all the previous ones that we've talked about, as well as all the ones from like today, and the ones going forward will be added eventually. So if anyone has any other questions, just let me know. I'm always available on my email, so feel free to email me. Sometimes it's easier when it's injuries because it's a little bit more individualized. Strength training on the days when you run. You could do some strength training on the days that you run. It just depends on what you're doing. So you might want to do an upper body workout for strength training and then run. What you don't want to do is really fatigue your lower body, because if you've fatigued it before you go running, you could be opening yourself up to other issues. So I would say if you're strength training on the same day that you run, maybe try to do something that's more upper body, or do your run before you do something lower limb, if that makes sense. So cracking knees, the one thing that you would worry about is just that the kneecap isn't sitting properly. So there's going to be some kind of frictioning going on. So there's something early happening that's going on in that joint. So first things to look for are the hip weakness, looking for tight tissue. If you don't actually take care of it early, it turns into something called, it turns into arthritis under your kneecap. And then you can get spurring and all sorts of not so nice things. So if you're getting cracking in the knees, I would suggest identifying early what you can do to help stop that. So if anyone has any other questions, I'm gonna say there's probably not, because you guys are pretty quiet. So either I did a good job and I answered all your questions, or you're being shy. So if you're being shy, just email me directly if there's some stuff that we can do to help you. But for sure, let me know, because we'd like you to continue on with us and keep running and not get injured. There's lots of little tricks of the trade, like lace locking. So if you're starting to get black toenails, for example, you can tie your shoelaces differently. It's called lace locking. If any of you are getting it, you can email me and I'll send you a link on it. And what it does is you put your laces back through the same hole and cross them over, and it prevents your foot from sliding. It can also help with blisters, that kind of thing. So there's all these little weird tricks of the trade that we use for different things with running that can help either keep you from getting those black toenails or help with the friction. Liquid in my knee when I squat. So generally your joints all have some fluid in their knees, which is what the joint uses for nutrition. But if there's extra fluid in the knee and you can see that it's a bit puffy or swollen, it is something that you should be addressing and something that you should be concerned about. So maybe email me directly and we will take a look at that. It does not matter how you roll with a lacrosse ball. You cannot do it wrong. The only thing you don't want to do is roll on a bone. Bone doesn't like to be frictioned. So I sometimes will put the yoga block down and a ball on it for the calf, and you can find a spot that hurts, and then you can flex and extend your toe, which then will floss that muscle underneath, and it really will free up that area. But there's really no wrong way to use a lacrosse ball. If it's painful, it probably needs a little bit of work on it, and it should become easier every time you do it. So if you did it for a week and did it a few times in that week, it should slowly get easier. But you're not going to hurt yourself doing it. You might cry a bit because it might hurt, but you're not going to hurt yourself. All right, so if nobody else has any questions, feel free to email me. And please come next week, because Leslie's going to have a great talk and it really ties into my topic. And so if you, we would prefer that everybody continues to run healthily and safely and doesn't have to see one of us. But these are all things that, like Leslie's talk's really going to help make sure that you're thinking about cross training and strengthening so that you're not going to have issues and you're not going to have to come in the office and see one of us to make sure that you're not going to create any long-standing injuries. All right. So thanks everyone, and we will see you next week.